How do you do? I'm Ed Keyes, Keyse. If you see it spelled that way, I'm probably related to him. I was born June 26, 1941. It's late winter 2025, so this June I'll be 84 years old. When I last did my talk for the Historic Society in Madison, I realized to my knowledge, am the last living person who worked at the Madison Willowcraft. The Madison Willowcraft started in 1908 with Mr. Teachout. Along came the depression of the 30s, and he was getting ready to retire. And my uncle, who had been working down at a large bank in downtown Cleveland, apparently was laid off, decided that he could go to work for Mr. Teachout for no money, but would take stock in the company as payments. And that arrangement was made. I really talk, when I do this talk, I do it as the Madison Willowcraft and the Keyes family, because that's the way I know it. There were four brothers, and the oldest was Nelson, who was the banker, and my father, J. Edward Keyes, was the youngest. He also had a sister that was younger than him. They came to Madison when my dad was only about 5 years old. My grandfather was one of the original people making Chiclee's chewing gum, and he had started some factories around the country for the owner. And with that money, he purchased the land on Route 20 in Madison, which I refer to as the Keyes Farm. My uncle came to live with my grandparents, so he didn't have a lot of out-of-pocket expenses, so he could do this get paid by stock arrangement very easily. Around that time, my father graduated from Dyke College downtown, so he was hired as the bookkeeper. My other uncle that was just older than my dad had been laid off from the Diamond Chemical Company, and Uncle Nil hired him to work in the tin shop. One brother, Kenneth, never worked at the Willowcraft. So that was all in the 30s. I'm going to, somewhere along the line, tell you about all the different people that did from my family that worked in there. But the Madison Willowcraft was located at 18 Eagle Street. The original three-story building was built around the Civil War times, and it was the only three-story building in the village of Madison. The three-story building was the original part, and that held the weavers on the second floor, and some of the painting, dip painting that was done on the first floor, the trimming and gluing section, which was next to the boiler, and that took in and all the storage or inventory area, but from the gluing and trimming area. The tin shop was in the one-story section, which was added on later. The tin shop and the wood shop were both under skylights in that one story, and in the very front corner on Eagle Street, in the southwest corner, was the office. The large shop doors, which you see on the front on the Eagle Street side, ran straight, that opening ran straight back into a large shed, which was added on to the three-story building, and painting was also done there. I'm going to describe to you the building of the most popular basket. I'm talking about the last 20 years of operation. It went by a style 17. It came in the 17, 10, 8, 10, 12, and 15, which were all longer baskets. We're talking about floral baskets. So the Madison Willowcraft was known as the Art Craft Floral Baskets. These were used by florists, and my father became the sales manager. I sold to big wholesalers in the cities, as well as individual florists in some of the smaller towns that didn't have access to some of these things. The most popular basket at that time was the 1710, and it's the one I'm going to use to describe to you the building of a basket, because it was so included all the main items. Ready? Yep. The 1710 has all the basic ingredients of a basket, except for flatwoods, which sometimes would be woven down at the lower end of the uprights. But you start with the wooden bottom, which is cut rectangle. Now, I said there's about 43 different actions that go into building a basket. And I do want to tell you right up front, there was only about 6 what you could refer to as a machine in the shop. And the first one is the big table saw that we cut all these boards on. In the tin shop, there were some tin shears, electric shears for cutting sheet steel. And then there was a spot welder. And in the wood shop also had a drill press and a bandsaw. That was the full equipment of power equipment. Everything else is hand labor. So these boards, you would cut boards that were stored in the wood shed that's alongside the one-story building right on the alley in Madison. And those boards would come in 20-foot lengths, and we'd have to cut them in half so we could handle them on the table saw. So we have 10-foot boards. We cut 9 of these bottoms out of there, and let's say we're doing an order of 100 1710s. So I'm going to cut off about 10 boards and get my first 50 out going, and then we'd stack those up behind the saw table on another table, and then we would change the vertical cut to a horizontal next to the blade for doing the beveling on the edge all the way around the basket. So you would cut one at a time when you were cutting the boards. Now, when you're beveling them, you have to flip it, cut it, flip it, cut it, flip it, cut it 4 times to get beveled all the way around. Then those had to be restacked. When you get to about 50 of them behind you, you would take that load up to the drill press, which was located on the 2nd floor, and the stairway was a huge 5-foot wide stairway that went up to the 2nd floor right about in the middle. We're talking of the 3-story building. So the drill press could get started on them, and then you'd cut another 50 and take them up. Now the drill press operator would first put 3 holes in the bottom, 1 at each end and 1 right in the center, 3/8-inch holes. And the hole in the center went on the spindle for the weavers. The end holes were for putting in the main willow for the handle. So before you could get there, you had to drill all these holes in the bottom. Then it went to a pounder's bench, and all these uprights had to be individually pounded in. They're 1/4-inch square. Yes, we put square pegs in round holes. And you had to do that all the way around. Now those would be up about 1 inch higher than what you see here in the trimmed, in the finished product. Once those were all pounded, that base, the bottom, would go over to the weaver. Now it's beginning to be a basket. The weaver would had a stand right in front of him. The weaver would place the basket down on that very shiny spindle. It was very shiny because they went on and off all day long. Then she would take wet reed that's been soaked in a 4-foot by 12-foot redwood soaking tank. The reed would be in there soaking, and the willows for the handles would be in there soaking. So they were always working with damp or wet material. Anyway, the weaver would take some of this reed and start the first layer around. She'd tuck it in and weave in and out, in and out, in and out, all the way around, and turning that basket on the spindle as she wove, all the way around. Then she'd start another row and go all the way around. If the reed came up short somewhere, she would just tuck it in behind where it stopped, behind the other one, and keep on going around until there's 4 rows of that reed. So if she's gone around 4 times at least with that basket. Now, the uprights and the bottom woven together would then go over to the handler. And the handler would take 2 willows. We start with 1 willow. Oh, by the way, the weavers worked at a bench that looked like a cobbler's bench, and it had a tray alongside with small nails, the trimming shears, and items that on awl and different items they might use while they were working on the basket. When it went over to the handler, he also had like a cobbler's bench, but instead of having this spindle out in front of him, he had a board about 6 inches wide coming out between his legs just a couple of inches. He would take the end of this basket and put it down on there, and then he would take 1 willow and stick it in this hole here and pound in a small brad nail so it's fastened to the basket. Then he'd turn it around and he'd put a willow on the other end and nail it in. Then he would take 2 willows and stick them down into the weaving going around the basket and break it back. And then he'd break the other one back. And then he'd bring them all 3 together, the one that's nailed in and the other 2, and he'd weave them together. Now, at this point, they're pointing straight up, 3 willows. Now he goes to the other end and does the same thing. He nails in a willow, he breaks off 2, bends them back, weaves them together. Then he takes both of those that are up here vertically and he weaves them together to get the rounded shape of the handle. The basket is now made as far as weaving goes. We would take that basket over to a 4x4 trap door in the floor and drop it down. And when we first got started, we'd try to drop them nice and straight to help pound those uprights in nice and tight. And that would go into a boarded storage area directly below the trap door. And right next to that was the copper gluing tank. In the morning, they'd turn on the gas fire under that tank and melt the horse glue, which had gotten all thick during the night, and stir it and get it to a nice, might have to add some more glue, might have to add some more water, get it just right. Now, there was a big table on a slight slant right next to the gluing tank, and the top of the basket, all those uprights would be sticking up about 1 inch. They all had to be trimmed off. Any reed sticking out from the weaver that might be sticking out might have to be trimmed off a little bit. Then that whole basket was dipped in the hot glue and put up on a rack, and the glue could drain back into the tank. After they were up there for a certain amount of time, we take them off and put them on the floor. Now, to the right was the painting department. To the left was a storage area. So maybe there's already 25 or 50 of these 1710s in the inventory. That woman would get those baskets out into the painting area on the floor for the painter to get to. And now the new baskets that are drying could be put off and stored so that the glue could dry better. Once the glue was on, it held the weaving together, it held the uprights in, and of course, it kept the basket from taking too much paint because we used a dip paint system. So the painter, Elsie Dewey, also did packing. But she would come along and get those baskets gathered up, and there was 3 painting stations, and 2 of them were white, and one of them was a very light green, this color right here. This is a liner, and I'll tell you about those in a few minutes that go in the basket. She would dip a basket at a time in the paint and put it up on a rack that was on about a 20-degree angle on 1-inch spaced 1-inch boards that were spaced about 10 inches apart. And then that paint would just drift back down into the tank, which was made out of a 55-gallon drum that had been cut in half and laid in the cradle. Okay, now after they were on there, she'd do one side, maybe have about a row, a second row, maybe 25 baskets on the one side. Then she'd start doing them on the other side. So maybe there's 50 baskets draining there. In the meantime, she could go to the other paint area where she would start dipping the liners that go into the basket. So that'll take me to the tin shop, and I'll tell you about making the liners. Here we see Don Conrad sitting at the soldering bench in the tin shop. But to start to get to him, you had to form that sheet metal. So there were 3x3 sheets, and I call them large razor blades. And believe me, they were sharp. You wanted to wear gloves if you were carrying those around anywhere, bringing them from the storage area to work area. We would lay 5 of those together. Elmer Triscutt was the head of the tin shop. He would take those 5 layers over to the spot welder, and he had to know from experience where to spot weld that thing so the spots didn't end up inside the part that he wanted to cut. After he had spot welded them together, he threw them over to the up behind him on a very large layout table, and he would take a form off the wall that was a pattern and scribe that steel. After he got a few of those stacked up, say, so 5 of those would be 25, and there would be several on each one that he would make. He'd have to take it to an electric shear and cut very carefully around what he had scribed on the iron. In the case of a 4-sided like this, you ended up with the 3-sided, one side bottom, the other side. Okay, now that had to go into a bender and be folded 90 degrees and 90 degrees. Now you had to put an end on each end of that. So those ends, they all had to be scribed and cut. And after they were cut, you'd have to take them over to a steel shear and trim off the corner on about a 45-degree angle so that it could be folded. The edges would be folded all the way around on 3 sides of that. Now it's ready to go to Don at the soldering bench. He would take one of those ends and a wooden form and push it up. There was a nice ridge built right into the workbench he was working on, and he'd shove that up in there nice and tight. And he had irons in a furnace, soldering irons, pretty good size. We bought solder in 1-pound bars, 50 to a box, so that was 50 pounds of solder you had to pick up to get to there. Put that bar on there, and he would start soldering all those seams, flip it over, solder all those seams, and he'd get a group up. Now they took them through the door into the 3-story. This was all in the 1-story tin shop under the skylight. You'd walk through a doorway into the old 3-story building, and right there was a large tank filled with paint thinner. Every one of these lighters was pushed down into that thinner to see if it leaked. If it leaked, it went in this stack. If it didn't leak, it went over here, ready to go to the painter. So that brings us back to Elsie. She would come and get those liners and dip paint them and put them on a rack with the light green, all right? So now you have baskets drying in the other room, and that, by the way, that in that shed, there was windows all the way along the north side. The north side of the building didn't have any windows at all, but the shed attached to it was all windows. So now she's got baskets drying there, and she's got liners drying in the other area. She would go in and start taking those baskets off of the rack and placing them on the floor. And they're still maybe a little tacky, but you could handle them at that point. After they were laid out there, and after these liners drained enough that they were dry enough to be handled, you would bring a stack of those under your arm and drop them down into the baskets that are on the floor. So you had to drop them you had to be accurate about this. It took some skill to get used to it, but you could drop that liner right into the basket and it would go right down to the bottom and set in there nice and tight. If you missed, it would flip off to the side. Now you got to bend over and pick it up and stick it in, and you're carrying a load up. So you wanted to hit every time. And she was very good at it. After those baskets were all lined up there with the liners in them, they would be moved into the shipping department, which was directly adjoining to that in the one-story building, which was attached to that shed. And they would be put into large 3x5 cartons, which would be laying down lengthwise. Everybody brought their used newspapers to work with them, not to read, to pack the baskets with. So there'd be a layer of newspaper in there, then there'd be another layer of baskets and so forth until it was full. And then they would be addressed with a nice dark pen, and then they would be brought a little forward and stood up on end so they didn't take up as much floor room, waiting for the MX 18-wheeler to come and pick them up and ship them. Now, when I went through the weaving of starting with the wood shop, cutting the bottom, the weavers, oh, by the way, we had to cut all those uprights with the bandsaw to the proper length, which was inscribed on the bandsaw's table to go to the pounder's bench. So you had to cut the bottoms, you had to drill the bottoms, you had to pound all the uprights in them, then the weavers had to do their thing, and then the handles had to go on. It had to be dipped in glue and dried. It had to be dipped in paint and dried, and the liner put in and then packed and shipped. And that's over 43 separate things that I've described to you when you really break it all down. And that's the reason nobody's building handcrafted floral baskets. It was all hand labor, which was very expensive. Over the years, the shop did furnish jobs to women. A lot of women worked there in the years when women didn't go to work very often. But if they needed to, there was a place they could go to work. And on some of the baskets that were more ornate, you could do them on piecework. And if you were fast, you could make a little better money doing some of those. The 1710 was a very basic basket, and that's why it ended up, you see, these florist wholesalers, they wanted to buy the cheapest thing they could that looked good. And that crunch of what they were willing to pay for a basket that's filled with flowers, of course, a lot of that went for funeral biscuit, but at the time, people sent baskets of flowers to people for different reasons, for functions and so forth. But anyway, it was all hand labor. My father was the township clerk at the time, and he had the clerk's office in the Willowcraft. And my mother came to work at the shop about the last 10 years. And so she was the secretary for both the township clerk and the Madison Willowcraft. And I did forget one little story. When my Uncle Les was laid off from the Diamond, he came to work there, and one of the fellas says, oh, I know some girls from Willoughby. And so he lined him up with a girl for a date. and that turned out to be my Aunt Thelma, who married Les, who built the house on the farm on 20. He built a house next door to the original farmhouse. The original farmhouse burned down the year I was born, 1941, and they built a new little retirement home for my grandfather and my grandmother there, which is still standing there. And they used it as an office at James Place for a while. And now the large house that is the office was the home that my Uncle Les built. Well, he married a girl from Willoughby, and she became the head dietitian of the Madison schools. And if you check some of the cauldrons, you might see her picture in there. I married a girl from Willoughby also. And Beverly was working at the Isley store, and I was delivering Coke in the summertime, and so that's how we met, taking Coke to the Isley store. And she just passed away this last Christmas, 24, but on the 29th, right after Christmas. Like I said, of the four brothers, Kenneth is the only one that didn't work at the Willowcraft, but Doris, the sister, she did. Aunt Doris Shelton, and she lived right in the middle of town in the village. Most of the people that worked at the shop lived in the village. But some people drove a little ways to get there, but most of them lived right in town. Do you have any questions? It's been fun telling you about working at the Willowcraft. I started there when I was about 10 years old, cleaning in the office, sweeping the office and emptying the waste baskets. And then I finally did a little bit of everything I told you about, except the handling. I never did the handles, but I worked in the tin shop a little bit, trimming, not soldering, but trimming some of the ends that had to go in. I ran that large table saw with a 20 horsepower motor on it. You didn't want to mess around with that thing. But anyway, and then I fired the boiler. My cousin did it. My cousin Jim and I worked together. We were like brothers. He was an only son. I was an only son. We ran around together. When I went to Ohio State, we were in the same fraternity together, and he was my big brother there. But anyway, the Keyes family was woven into the Madison Willowcraft. It's been nice telling you the story.